Hey savvy people, it's Savvy Nick here, and today we'll be installing Arch Linux on a virtual machine the easy way with the new and official Arch Linux install script. That's right, Arch Linux has done us a solid and released an official script that comes with the ISO installer, and that's what I use to install this Arch Linux setup running right in front of me. All right, jumping right in, we'll want VirtualBox for this one. That's the virtualization software we're using in order to run our Arch Linux setup here today on Windows 10. This makes it easy without having to actually install Arch Linux on your physical computer. Instead, you could run it in an emulated environment called VirtualBox. You can get it at virtualbox.org. I'll make sure to post a link in the description below. So I'll hit the big download VirtualBox, the latest version, and I'll scroll down and look for Windows Host since we're installing this on a Windows machine today. When I hit on Windows Host, that will launch the actual download for the installer. Save that file, and once that's downloaded, just run through the install wizard. It's very simple to follow through, just like any other application that you would install on Windows. After that, we'll go over to the archlinux.org website where we'll download an ISO, also known as an install image here. And if we look down, the latest news here in April, the latest installation medium comes with a guided installer. That's what I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and that's what we'll be using. It's very exciting. It makes the whole process much easier instead of manually having to do everything and install Arch. You'll see how much faster it is with this install script. So next we'll go to the top, hit the download section where we're going to download an image that we can use for the install. Here it says the latest image is April 1st, 2021, what kernel it has, how big it is, and if we scroll down, we can select through the various different mirrors available in different countries. I'll go down to my section, which is the United States, get the mirror closest to you, and I'm going through one of these, and I know kernel.org is a pretty trusty source, so I'll download it from that mirror. What I'm looking for in these options, and if you get these options, is the Arch Linux 2021.0401, signifying it was released at the beginning of the month in April of 2021. The x86 64-bit ISO, that's the type of architecture we'll be installing it on in our virtual machine. That's the one I want. I'll click on that. I'll save this file and let it download. At this point, we have VirtualBox installed and we're ready to go and run the program. Launch your VirtualBox by searching for it. Just type in virtual. It should come up. Oracle VM VirtualBox is what we want to run. Otherwise, you might have an icon at the bottom. You can click and start from there as well. All right, and once things pop up, you'll see a screen similar to this. Now, of course, if you haven't used it before, you're not going to have any virtual machines already set up. I got plenty here, and this script could have saved me a lot of time on some of these other Arch-based installations that I've made in the past, and that's why I love the fact that they've released this. Also, if you're new and stopping by, make sure to take a moment and subscribe below. Hit that notification bell for more Linux and operating system videos. Let's start in by creating a new virtual machine. On the top here, we can click on Tools, and that will give us a new menu over here on the right side. Let's click on New, which then allows us to start the setup process for our virtual machine. First, we can name our virtual machine. I'm calling it Arch Linux, and then the machine folder. The standard is fine for me. If you want to put it in a different directory, you can, of course. And since I typed in Arch Linux, it detected the type and version of Linux that I want to install already. If this wasn't picked out for you, make sure the type is Linux and the version is Arch Linux 64, since we're installing with the 64-bit image. All right, next after that, we now can select how much memory we want to give our virtual machine. Just make sure you're not really in the orange or red zones. Anything else is fine. I do highly suggest giving it at least 1 gig of memory. You can do with less, but if we're going to have any kind of desktop environment, we're going to need a little bit more. I'll go for 8192 since I got plenty of memory on my system. This is 8 gigs of memory. I'll hit next after that. Now I'm ready to create a new virtual hard disk right now. I'll click that and hit create. Here I can choose between various different formats of virtual disks. Some play a little easier and are easier to export to different virtualization softwares, but for now I'll go with the native VirtualBox disk image VDI file and hit next. We have to choose between what type of storage we want for our physical hard disk, dynamically allocated versus fixed size. Fixed size means it takes up all the storage right off the bat. there won't be a growing pattern. So usually the best option is just to go with the dynamically allocated, because that only grows as the system grows. So it's not taking a bunch of your host storage space up, because you are of course limited to whatever your Windows storage device can support. So dynamically allocated helps. I'll hit next. Now I get to specify what size I want to use for that dynamically allocated virtual disk, and I'll give mine 64 gigs. You can give yours whatever you want. You'll want to stay above 8 gigs, or you might run into trouble with your root file partition being too small. 64 gigs is pretty typical for me. I usually go over 32 at the very least. Anyways, as long as you're not starving your own system of storage, this is fine. Again, it's not going to use the 64 gigs up all the way. Instead, it will grow as the Arch Linux file system grows. Next, I'll hit create, and that will actually create our virtual machine. We've gone through all the steps in the wizard, but there are a few things I like to edit in the settings to make my emulation a little better. I'll hit settings, and then I'll go over to system settings, where I'll select enable EFI. This says special OSs only, but most Linux distributions as well as operating systems now support EFI partitions. So it's nice to emulate in this mode because most modern motherboards actually have UEFI already built on them, and it's become pretty much the standard, so it's nice to emulate in that mode. Following that, you can go to processor and give yourself some more CPU cores if necessary in order to run better emulation. Of course, don't go into the orange or red zones. We'll keep going down to a few more setups, including the storage settings, where I see I have a controller IDE currently empty. This is where I want to attach the disk that I just got done downloading. So that ISO image, I'll click down on the CD here and choose a disk file. And here I'm introduced to the File Explorer, where I can select in my Downloads folder the Arch Linux 2021-0401 x86 64 image that I just got done downloading, and I'll hit open. This right here will act as a virtual disk as well as a virtual drive that's reading the virtual disk. That way we can boot into the install for Arch Linux and run that Arch Linux install script. If you went ahead and made it this far, please smash that like button, and let's continue on by going to audio. You can enable or disable the audio. I don't like getting audio back from my virtual machine, so I'm going to turn that off. Finally, I'm going to go down to the user interfaces, just check one thing. Everything looks all right here. I'm going to hit OK. And at this point, we can launch Arch Linux so we can start the install process here in the virtual machine. All right, I'm going to hit start with it selected and give it a few moments here to boot up. You might get this select startup disk. That's because there's multiple disks that it thinks it wants to go look through. Just make sure that this is actually selected on the Arch Linux 2021-0401 x86 64 ISO. Otherwise, it'll try booting some other image. You probably won't get this unless you've tried installing other operating systems in the past. I'm going to hit start, and that will boot our machine very much like this here. Let me make this a little bigger so we can see things. All right, so if we click inside, our mouse is going to go away, and we can go through the various different options here. We want the very first option in order to boot into the install medium. Let's press enter and give it a moment to start up here. If things successfully loaded up, we'll see a cow with a little comment for us here. Congratulations, you've made it into the Linux console and it's ready for Arch to be installed on this virtual machine. All right, I cleared things out so we can start the install process. What I'll do is first go into full screen mode so we can see everything a little better. You can do that by hitting Control F. That'll get you there. And here we are in full screen mode. I'm going to type in Arch install, all one word, lowercase. This is the new script. It's a Python script. You can look it up that Arch Linux is supplying for us to make it a lot easier to install things instead of manually having to go through things. I'm going to press enter and give it a few moments. We see all of our options here for languages, and the one I want is the very last one, 21, which is the US. You can also enter a question mark in to search for more languages. So this will apply a language for our keyboard. 21 again, US is fine for me. Then I'll press enter. Next, we're asked which region we're from. 52 for me, for the United States. You can, of course, go through the list and figure out what region is closest to you or you're currently in. Again, it's easiest just to select the numbers instead of typing out the regions. I finished typing 52 and I'll press enter. Next, this is great because we're being asked what disk we want to install everything on and partition for our Arch Linux system. We're given 3 devices here, device loop 0, the current booted Arch Linux ISO, so we won't touch that. 2 is dev sr0. That also seems like something that pertains to the image. Forget that. So number 1, the dev SDA, that type of a label is for a storage disk, so that looks right. Another hint here is I selected 64 gigs for my total storage space, so that makes a lot of sense. I'll select 1 and then press enter. Following that, we're asked what type of file system do we want to create on our main partition. So you have 4 options here. You can read up on them, but I'll go with the standard, which is the ext4 file system. If you like using another one better, you can select a number and then press enter. Here we're asked to encrypt our disk. All this does is adds a password on top of the normal user passwords in order to get in and start using your disk. If you want disk encryption, you can type in your paraphrase and then enter it in a second time. Otherwise, you can just press enter and leave it blank. I'll leave mine blank. Next, I'm asked for a desired host name for the installation. I'm going to use SavvyNick. You can call it whatever you want. This is what other computers on the network will recognize your computer as, if they can see it, of course. So SavvyNick is fine for me. I'm going to press enter. Next, I'm asked for a root password. So this is for the administrative user. Put in your password. Even though it's not typing, it is taking the characters. Press enter when you're done. And one more time for verification purposes. That way you make sure you entered the password in correctly. Also, if you didn't want a administrative user, you could have just left the last one blank and pressed enter. That won't set up a root user. After confirming the password, press enter. If all things went well, it'll move on and ask us if we want to create a normal user and what that username will be. I will create a normal user. I'll call him SavvyNick. You can of course leave it blank if you want to skip right over creating a new user. I'm going to press enter after that. It's asking for a password at this point for that user. Very similar to what we did for root. You can create your new password. It can be different. It doesn't have to be the same. And it's probably best that it remains not the same. But either way, type in the password, press enter, and verify that password once more. And now we're good. We're being asked whether or not we want to set up this user to use sudo. If we choose this option, that means that the user that we just created will have super privileges, so they can become an administrator. So should my user be super? Yes, I'm going to use that, so I'll press Y. The default option is no. If you press enter, you won't have super privileges with that user. I'll press enter after that. Now I'm being asked again, do I want to create another user? Well, if you have multiple users, at this point you can create more of them. I won't be creating any more, so I'm going to just press enter. With the Arch Linux installer script here, we can select a pre-programmed profile. If you want, you can install basic tools for any of the following profiles. If you want to use Awesome, Desktop, GNOME, Desktop Environment, KDE Desktop Environment, KDE with Wayland support, or Xorg, you can select one of the above. But I won't mess with this because I want the absolute minimal installation of Arch Linux here. So I'll leave this one blank because you can install everything and anything after the fact. And that's kind of the purpose here anyway. Keeping things minimal and really customizing things to your needs from a minimal setup. So I'll press enter. I'm asked at this point whether I want to add additional packages to install. You can if you want. I'm going to add the netctl package and dhcpcd. Just in case I need it for networking purposes later on. I'll just put a space between those two and press enter. Of course, if you have more packages, you can keep adding them in, just put spaces between them. Maybe there's something that you like to have standard on an Arch Linux install. Of course, you can put that package in here. Again, after the fact, you can install it as well. So at this point, I'll press enter. Now, one of my favorite parts is this Arch Linux install script also can help set up your network interface. So one of the things people forget once installing Arch Linux is that you need packages as well as setting up those packages to run networking post-install. This script makes it very easy. I'm just going to select option 0, which is going to copy the current network configuration onto installed Arch Linux setup. So 0, and then I'll press enter. Here we can enter in a valid time zone by putting in our continent followed by a major city on one of those continents. For example, they gave us Europe and then Stockholm. Another example would have been Americas and then / New York City. Either way, you can look up valid time zones and put yours in as necessary, or something at least close by you that's in the same time zone. I'll just use the example and press enter. If you want to look above, you'll get to review all the setup that's going to happen. After you press enter, it will begin the installation. I know everything looks all right for me, so I'm going to continue the installation by pressing enter. It'll take about 5 seconds to start formatting things, and then it will install some basic packages here. It's installing the base package, the base development package, the Linux kernel and firmware package, and EFI boot manager, since this is an EFI based virtual machine. And lastly, it says Nano as well, which is just a text editor, making things a little easier whenever you're finally installed to edit your text files. We'll give this a few minutes in order to finish up the installation process. And then after this, we should be very close to being able to reboot into our brand new Arch Linux setup on a virtual machine inside of VirtualBox. At this point, smash that like button if you haven't already, because we're almost done. And once things have finished installing, you'll see this installation completed without errors in green for you, and that you can now reboot. That's great. It did also say a few things above, such as it enabled our network for us, added a bootloader, systemd bootctl, onto the newly created EFI partition. It installed a couple extra packages, the netctl and dhcpd package, created our user, made our user sudo, and put our password in for root. Okay, quite exciting. So instead of rebooting, I like to shut things down. So I'll do sudo shutdown now. There's a reason for this. So I'm shutting down. And once things are shut down, I'll be back to my VirtualBox software where I can manage things. I'll go back into settings because I want to remove in the storage the disk that I currently have in. Otherwise, we'll boot right back into the installer. So I can click on this CD here and hit remove disk from virtual drive. Once it says empty, I can hit OK. And now I'm ready to start my virtual machine again with Arch Linux on it. Let's hit the start button and give it a few moments to start right back up. Very good. I'm now welcomed by a login screen here, and it says Arch Linux 5.11.13. So I can type in my username that I created during the install process. So mine's SavvyNick. Type in my password for SavvyNick, and look at that. I am greeted by SavvyNick at SavvyNick. Congratulations if you made it this far. You've successfully installed Arch Linux in a virtual machine using VirtualBox on Windows 10. Quite a mouthful, but very rewarding once you've done this, and the Arch Linux new install script has made life easier for us. It's awesome that they've added that in. Let's check a couple things in this environment before we end things here. First thing, I'll want to make sure that I can ping something. So I'll try archlinux.org. This will confirm that I actually have an internet connection, which will help me install packages. Otherwise, it's not going to be good because I'm then unable to get any kind of packages, which will help customize my system here. Sure enough, I can ping things out, so that looks good. You can end things by hitting Control C. Use the right control and then press C. That'll make things easier for you. I'll clear things out again. That's a very good sign. If you have network access, that really allows you to do most things that are necessary, like installing our first package. But before we do that, let's do sudo su just to see if we can log in as root. You might be asked for a password. Type that in. It's your normal user's password. And let's download that first package right away. And that's if we can elevate our privileges to the super user with the normal user here. And if we can actually install a package from the Arch Linux repo. So I'll do sudo pacman -S and then U, which will get the repos, sync them, as well as upgrade things. And then I'll type neofetch. It's asking me if I want to install neofetch. Sure. And it looks like everything is finished now. And if I type neofetch as my new package, we can see here that we have Arch Linux x86 64-bit running on VirtualBox 1.2 with kernel version 5.11.13. It's been up for a few minutes and things are looking great. The best part of it, it's only using 72 megabytes out of the 8 gigs available, which is pretty wild to think about. Of course, as a virtual machine, you will need to install some guest utilities in order to make sure that things get rendered properly and work even better in your virtual machine. You can do that by typing in sudo space pacman space -syu, and we'll do the VirtualBox guest utils. And if you don't want that with X support, you can throw in no X at the end. Otherwise, just keep it like this. This is fine for me. I want X support. So I'll press enter and let these libraries as well as the utility install on my computer. Well, that should be it. You can check out the rest of my videos to help you get set up in Arch Linux and start moving around, as well as fix the Linux console resolution and set the font like I did here to be able to see it a lot easier. Also, a few more tips and tricks, as well as an awesome X monad window manager setup. If you want to check that out, search for it on the channel. I'll put a link in the description below. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please make sure to post them in the comments section below. Also, make sure to subscribe for future videos and make sure to like the video. Catch me in a great community on Discord, and I'll catch you in another video. Thanks for watching.